it's great to have everyone. I wanted to open with a question and hear any midrash or story or anything, when you imagine the giving of the Ten Commandments, what you've heard from our tradition or how you might imagine this moment of receiving the Ten Commandments.
I'm sorry.
Just ask if there's any, stories you've heard from our tradition or anything you imagine when you picture kind of the people all at Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments. David, yeah.
From our tradition, from the tradition of Cecil B. DeMille, but I always thought one of the things I liked about that depiction in the movie is that the voice he hears is his own voice. It's Charlton Heston who's narrating
Right.
God's.
Okay.
And I think that's kind of a neat choice from the point of view of cinema because it's a way of dealing with something that's virtually impossible to deal with, which is how is Moses actually face to face with God?
Okay, how is this moment of revelation? Yeah, Ron and then Billy.
Well, what I'm thinking about is how confusing the parsha is, as far as the order, what did they really hear, what was really going on? I mean, it's totally confusing.
Okay, yeah, no, it is.
First, it lists the Ten Commandments, and then it says they don't want to hear it after the first two.
We'll check back in an hour.
Right.
And everything will be.
Yeah, what did you, yeah.
So David, I don't go with Cecil B. DeMille, I go with Mel Brooks, 15 Commandments. Where you start with.
Right, the 15, sorry, one drop, so then it's one tablet drop. Right?
So there's a personal thing about, I don't know, 20, 25, I don't know, I was asked to teach something sometime and it was around this and I got involved in reading and studying the physical components of the tablets per se and how they were written on both sides at once, different versions. So I was intrigued by the materials that were mentioned. It took it beyond the movie version, which did seem to be a little too simplistic to something a little more complex, even in how it was presented in physically.
Okay,
Where you're
great.
gonna go, but that's
Yep.
something.
I've got one more.
Yeah. And then
This
Judy,
is
yeah.
from Rabbi Asher Wade, who's a black hat Orthodox rabbi who started out Christian. And he discusses why did he convert to Judaism? And he said that when he was in Berlin and he was visiting the site, which I guess we also visited, of the great synagogue that was destroyed by the Nazis and now it's a shell. It occurred to him that the difference between Judaism and anything else he had studied was that everybody else has a revelation of one person, a prophet like Muhammad, or Jesus is conveying something from Jesus, but not. He said what attracted him to Judaism is that the Aseret HaDibrot are revealed to the entire community, at least the first two. Maybe they heard all 10, maybe they only heard the first two. There seems to be controversy about that, although the plain meaning of the text sounds more like one or two.
Okay,
But to him, the biggest import of all this is that revelation is to the entire community and not just.
okay, that's right. That revelation is to all and not just one. Yeah, Judy.
My story is not deep, but it's an Israel story. So my son bar mitzvah was Israel, and fast forward decades later, I was in Florida in shul, short sleeve. They're reading Yitro, and I'm confused, like, why is it Yitro? It took me a while to realize I'm in Florida, it's 80 degrees there, it's still winter in Cleveland.
Right. Good. So actually, all of this is great. And I actually, think that the Ten Commandments aren't written in such a clear way. And there is a sense of awe and mystery, even within the Torah itself, around, what's happening at Sinai. If you look at the sheet here, and it's here also on the screen, maybe bigger. I want to start, and I think this especially relates to what David said about our revelation in the Torah being a communal revelation, not a revelation to one prophet or one person. And if you look at this verse here, I'll read it, and I'm going to read it in Hebrew first, because what we're going to look at in a commentary is questioning this verse. Vayis'u mirfidim, having journeyed, the people, a plural from Refidim, vayava'u midbar Sinai, they came to the Sinai desert, the Sinai wilderness, vayachanu bamidbar, and they encamped, vayichan sham Yisrael, and it camped, it changes from plural to singular, that Yisrael camped, neged hahar. And
Israelis people,
what?
so Israelis people, nation,
Right,
so still it's plural, I mean,
it's a nation.
still means everybody, all.
It
all
means
of them.
it
Yeah.
means everyone, but the commentary here from, this is Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, suggests that in the verse, it says, it uses the plural, and at the end, it uses the singular. It interprets, the Midrash interprets that it was people that were coming and they had their quarrels, they had their differences, but when they camped at Mount Sinai, they were one. That Yisrael suddenly was unified and they were of one heart. And I think a play, actually, an interesting, that right, in many traditions, revelation is to one person. Here, this commentary is that all of us were as one. We were all unified, and in fact, there's a famous Midrash that all Jewish souls, whether or not they were alive at the time, past, present, future, were all present at Sinai, unified as one to receive the 10 Commandments. It's led to various, plays. There's Met You at Sinai, which is, is a Jewish dating app that, that everyone, playing on this idea that everyone was at Mount Sinai, all the Jewish people were at Mount Sinai together.
Whether they're
Yeah.
Jewish or not.
Yeah, no, and that's actually part of the tradition. Whether they were born Jewish or they chose to become Jewish, by virtue of becoming part of the Jewish community, their soul, it was known and their soul was already there at Sinai.
Left the community, so have been there and then.
Well,
Oh, we're.
the Midrash doesn't go into such detail, so,
Halacha says, once you're a
But-
Jew, you're always a Jew.
but right, halachically speaking, once a person is Jewish, they're always considered as a Jew, and there's actually even a category, there's a category in the Talmud that refers to people who are no longer practicing or who maybe were born Jewish but were raised in another practice, and considers them as though they were lost at sea or kidnapped, but that they're still part of the Jewish community.
What about
The interesting thing about it is that in English, they would be talking about, oh, wait a minute. No, it said Yisrael. I'm sorry. Because it's in English, that it makes perfect sense. They traveled, they encamped. And when you talk about Israel, Israel is still a single.
Right. And Fiona makes a good point. There's nothing wrong grammatically with the sentence. Israel, although refers to a people, is one word and is in the singular. So this Midrash is playing on the fact that it goes from plural to singular. But as Fiona correctly pointed out, there's nothing, that they
Unusual.
grammatically incorrect. They didn't need to find this, but this was how our tradition interprets this switch from plural to singular. And I see Nelson, did you have something to share?
Yeah, I was wondering whether if we're one people and everybody, one revelation, was there really just one voice? To everybody it sounded like themselves talking. And I actually couldn't see you at Sinai because I only saw one person at Sinai, me.
So beautiful. And I didn't share this Midrash, but there is in the Midrash, the idea that God's voice came in 70 different voices and each person heard the voice that they could most connect with. And there are many different Midrashim, right? There's also, there's so many Midrashim that reflect very different viewpoints of what it looked like being at Mount Sinai. In fact, yeah.
They heard what it satisfied their
Right.
minhag.
Right, now that each person heard the mitzvot, heard the revelation at Sinai according to the best way they could understand it. They could take it in. And here, is there anyone that wants to read in English? Shmot Rabbi, this is from the Midrash. What happened when God spoke at Mount Sinai?
Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yohanan, when the Holy One, blessed be he, gave the Torah, no bird tweeted, no fowl flew, no bull lowed, no wheels of the divine chariot flew. Seraphs did not say, holy, holy. The sea did not tremble, people did not speak, but rather the entire world was quiet and silent. The voice emerged, I am the Lord your God.
Okay, good. So any thoughts here? This, Shmot Rabbah is imagining that the world stood still, that everything stopped, so that God could speak. Yeah.
Reminds me of the full eclipse. Oh,
Yeah.
we were
Well,
all
like
speechless,
everything kind of came to a standstill, yeah.
absolute silence.
Yeah, did you?
No, that wasn't too hard.
But I didn't have anyone to share. Yeah,
Silence, you can hear better and you can understand better. If there is multiple people talking, there is trouble understanding and hearing what somebody else is saying. So
Yeah.
the absolute silence is very important.
no, it is beautiful. And there is another midrash I'll bring out. There was some discussion here, according to the Torah, whether all of the commandments were uttered by God or Moshe, or whether the first or just the first two. A midrash explains, a prominent midrash explains that all that God said to the entire community was the very first letter. Does anyone know what the first letter is in the Ten Commandments? It's an aleph, right? And what sound does aleph make?
Nothing.
Actually, right. With the aleph, with the vowel, it's an a, but the aleph itself, there's no really audible sound when we say aleph. But the midrash says, right, simply that the breath, the inaudible aleph was so powerful to the community that they said, no, we can't hear God. We need to have Moses share the words. It was that God's voice was so powerful that even the inaudible aleph was too much for the people to hear.
So,
Yeah.
so cynical at times. So this is telling me that immediately we're getting Torah as an interpretation rather than from the direct source. Right? I mean, we accept.
So an interesting idea. Yeah, that midrash implies that it's from Moshe, right? That it's from Moshe. Now we see the Torah as being passed down. In fact, Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, if you see the very first says that God gave the Torah to Moshe at Mount Sinai, and Moshe gave it to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua to the next generation, to the next, until the elders. So Torah is transmission, right? And the rabbis are part of that transmission. That's how they view the world of Torah. The people writing these stories view it all as transmission. There's different groups that have pushed back on that idea, but Torah is all about transmission, yeah.
So at least these first two, starting with the paragraph from Shmot Rabbah. I didn't turn the page, so maybe there's more. Are some way of trying to express to us the ineffable or the inexplicable or the mysterious or what have you, in some kinds of terms that you can understand. So what is, the second one is taking just the first word or maybe just the first letter and trying to make that case, if you will. Maybe that's the whole point of this. It's not unlike when we talk about hearing the lightning and seeing the thunder. Some kind of experience that's beyond normal experience.
Okay, yeah.
It also has a feeling of a creation story. Everything, there's silence, everything is dark, everything, there's nothing going on. The first thing now here is God. It's a creation,
Yeah.
maybe of us.
Yeah, in a sense, right, you start the Torah with the creation of the world here,
Right.
in a sense, is the creation of people, right, connected with God.
Where does Na'aseh and Nishma appear? I'll question later and follow. Has there been a weakening of the following over the generations? Hence, why do we have Yom Kippur? What has happened? As a result of the transmission over the centuries?
So the people in the Torah, when presented with God's word, do say, right, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do, and then we will hear, what it is we're supposed to do. But there's such an eagerness to accept the Torah, and not necessarily in the Torah itself, but we know from the transmission over history, over time, that things change, right? In fact, the oral Torah, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, according to our tradition, in addition to a written Torah given to Moses at Mount Sinai, there's also, an oral law that's transmitted to Moshe at Mount Sinai, that's passed down from generation to generation. And a feeling, many, many generations later, by the time that the Mishnah and the Talmud are written, which are actually the oral law. If it's oral law, why does it need to be written down? But a feeling that it was going to be lost. The Torah and the tradition around the Torah needed to be written down so that it could be understood. And right, we believe, and this is part of the conservative movement, but all of Judaism, that it needs to be interpreted, for our community, for our generation. And that may not, what we do may not be identical to what our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents did, but it needs to be rooted in the Torah. Our interpretations, commentary today is rooted in the commentary and in the Torah itself.
But if you don't write something down, one hears one thing and the other hears something else.
Even when it's written down.
So
mean,
it's
it's
true,
like- it's
right?
like
And
a
it
game
can
of
be true if it's
telephone.
written down as well. One of my favorite midrashim, which I don't have here, is a story of in the Talmud, that Rabbi Akiva, meets with God, and God wants Rabbi Akiva to see, Moses on Mount Sinai, is worried, right? What will happen to this Torah? And God brings him into Rabbi Akiva's classroom, 1,000 years later. And Rabbi Akiva is teaching something, and Moses has no idea what's going on. And Moses says, right, this is the Torah I'm receiving. I have no idea what's going on in this classroom.
I heard that before.
Until, right, you probably have done this, talked about this, Midrash, but until, right, someone asks Rabbi Akiva, how do you know this? And he says it's Torah LaMoshe Sinai. It's the Torah given to Moses at Sinai. And Moses is put at ease that even though he has no idea what's going on in this classroom 1,000 years from now, it all is based originally on the Torah that Moshe is receiving.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what language was the commandments in? And did the different scribes have a different interpretation as to what the commandments were, or how many there should be?
So that's a great question, and actually brings us to the next section here. According to our tradition, they were given in Hebrew, but as I mentioned, the Midrash, there is a Midrash that says they were spoken in 70 different ways, uttered in 70 different ways, so that each person could hear the voice that resonated with them. But we do believe, the Torah and our tradition, whatever you believe about the origins of the Torah was in Hebrew. Even, the earliest versions of the Torah were written in an ancient Hebrew script that we don't use anymore. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, which actually represent the earliest copy of the Torah that we still, have physical copy of, are in Hebrew.
Isn't it Aramaic?
Aramaic is actually later than ancient Hebrew, but Aramaic was the dominant language in the time of the Talmud. So much of the Talmud itself is actually written in Aramaic. But even in the Talmud, when they quote biblical sources, they quote it in the Hebrew.
Mishnah in it is always Hebrew.
The Mishnah is in Hebrew. You're right. Scholars might call it Proto-Hebrew. I'm not saying it's identical to the Hebrew that's spoken in Israel today, but it's related. It's related. So a good question. What are the commandments? And I will start with this first commandment. Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mi beit avadim. I, Adonai, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Now, I did just say the 10 commandments because that's the term that we use. Generally speaking, everyone is familiar with the 10 commandments. Can anyone remind us the term in Hebrew? Aseret hadibrot. Decalogue is English, sort of.
No, it's Greek.
It's Greek more, but right, what does Aseret hadibrot mean? Any of our Hebrew speakers? Does it mean 10 commandments?
No. Just
10 words.
sayings.
10 sayings, 10 utterances, 10 pronouncements. Dibrot comes from ledaber, to speak, right? If it were saying 10 commandments, mitzvah is actually a commandment. It would say aseret hamitzvot, right? The 10 commandments. And there is a debate within rabbinic literature as to whether this, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, the house of bondage, does that sound like a command?
No.
It's a saying.
No,
Doesn't sound like a commandment to me.
it's a fact.
It's a fact. Okay, now we'll start actually here. Sefer HaMitzvot. This is a book that Maimonides, Rambam, wrote. He considers it a commandment, and he'll share what is the commandment. Does anyone want to read here in English? Yeah.
That is the command that he commanded us to believe in God. And that is that we believe that there is an origin and cause, that he is the power of all that exists, and is his saying, I am the Lord your God.
Good. So this book is a book, Maimonides creates a book to elucidate the 613 mitzvot. We hear 613 mitzvot, but if anyone asked us to point out what are the 613, it would be very hard to go through the Torah necessarily and say 1, 2, 3, 4.
The Sefer HaShechina.
So, right, there are books that do it, and one of them is actually Maimonides' book, Rambam's book, Sefer HaMitzvot. This first mitzvah, according to Maimonides, is a mitzvah that the command to believe in God, right? We believe that there is an origin and cause, and God is the power of all that exists. So that's the mitzvah.
One of the things, Shalom Paul, who was, I don't know if you knew him. He was from the seminary, and he taught at Hebrew University, and he spoke here. And he said, this is all a pact. In other words, the first 2 or 3 are not commandments as such. They're just establishing who he is and what he's done for us. Then he tells us what we're supposed to be doing. But this is essentially a pact that he's made with the people. I think I've said this before because I mean, it really made an impression on me.
Yeah, so we're gonna actually see other sources for that same idea coming up. But yeah.
And this is probably along the same idea, but we first heard Yud-Hey, Vav-Hey at, when Moses asked God, what should I tell who you are to them? And this is the first time we heard it. I think it's full circle. Now instead of burning bush, it's the burning Torah in a way. And God saying, I'm the one.
Okay, good, right. So this is kind of like the same as when God introduces God's self to Moses. Yeah.
We can also throw in here, consistent with what Sheila said, a relatively common thread of historical analysis, which suggests that if we look at other ancient Near Eastern writing, that a lot of this is in the form of the kinds of covenants that were made between a suzerain and those who had fealty to him. So that kind of language, in a sense, mimics what you see in Mesopotamian things that would say, I am so-and-so at the start of the document. And that's the suzerain, the overlord.
Okay, so we're gonna see in a minute, that opinion in rabbinic literature as well. I'm gonna jump down one because they were they're not in order based on who says what, but if you jump down to Ibn Ezra, who is at the bottom of page 2 here, he shares the same belief that this is a command, just like Maimonides does. And he says, take the first commandment to mean that we are to believe with a faith transcending all doubt that the Lord, whose name is written but not uttered, is alone our God. So Maimonides and Ibn Ezra, 2 prominent medieval commentators, consider this statement to be a commandment. But as many of you shared, not everyone shared that belief. Yeah.
So since the commandments are supposed to be, if you will, individual commandments and nothing in the Torah is there for no reason, what is the reason then to have the opening words of the Shema if it's already here?
Oh, it's a good question. I would need to see what the commentaries, state, and it also will depend on what rabbi or leader thinks about this opening statement. But it's a good question.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I just had a thought with the opening, the three opening words of the Ten Commandments. That we have many facets of God, and one is sort of the parental figure.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking those first few that statements and commandments are God's presence saying, this is what I am doing for you, this is what I have done for you, setting kind of the stage. And then as the parental figure, this is what I need from you. This is what you
Right,
need.
this is so right. This is the model, and we're gonna actually see this here, right? The model is that this is who I am. I'm God, the parent. And then the following 9, or really 8 commandments, because the first 2 are both kind of this introduction. I am God, I'm the only God, right? You shall have no other gods. And then a list of the things that you need to do, right? To be devout and respectful. Right, you shall make no, you shall not use my name in vain, you shall observe Shabbat, you shall honor, your parents,
And then the five
and so
negatives.
on and so forth, right?
Only 3 positives and 5 negatives.
Right, right. So Or Hashem, this is a rabbinic work that has a differing view, right? Shared by some here. It is the nature of God to only be the one commanding, not a thing that is commanded. Yet this is the famous mistake of those who count it as a positive commandment, belief in the existence of God. So he's saying, right, God is the only one commanding, right? There can't be a commandment to believe in God. You need to do it already. It's kind of an opening statement. The mistake is that the commands do not stand alone. There is no system of commands without a known and recognized commander. And for this, when you count believing in God as a commandment, you already assume the existence of a God to command you, which you already knew that you should believe in, right? If you don't believe in God, who cares about the rest of it, right? Yeah.
So 2 things. One is, even though we've just had the Exodus experience, and I don't discount that or pretend anything negative about that, this statement in and of itself says that there's a God to believe in. If what he's saying is, you don't need that statement because the whole book presupposes that statement, okay. But the fact that that might be the case doesn't seem to me to negate that you could have a sentence like this, especially for those who might not go along with that. And maybe he's not writing at a time when you have so much belief in the idea that science supersedes religion, as opposed to they can go hand in hand in different ways. But a lot of people do have that point of view, so maybe this is directed at those.
Okay, it could be. But you mentioned here, right, the Israelites that are at Mount Sinai have experienced the signs and wonders, as we talk about, the Passover Seder is filled with, with God's signs and wonders, which the people have experienced. They've seen the 10 plagues against the Egyptians. They've seen the splitting of the sea. And here they're at a moment at Mount Sinai with thunder and lightning and this awe-filled moment and the voice of God, God's self.
But it kind of brings me to my second point, which is we read only a very short time after all of this that they're already want to build a golden calf and complain about the situation in the wilderness and where is Moses? He's gone, he's probably dead, et cetera, et cetera. So even if we don't accept the first thing I said, we might look at the second thing as we somehow need this because after
Yeah.
the lightning and thunder are done and after the sea is reclosed, in other words, after the miracle, it seems like we don't retain it very well.
So, right, and I think the Torah provides a great reminder that human memory is short, right? That we make mistakes. In fact, right, Moses, God is, this is in a few parchiot from now in Kitisa, and the timeline, right, is a question, is a separate question of when everything happens. But when we learn about the episode of the golden calf, right, God says to Moses, look at all the wicked, evil things, all of what your people are doing. They're breaking these initial, statements immediately. They're not recognizing that I'm God. They're not saying no other gods before you. And God says, let me wipe them out. Or God actually says, I am going to wipe them out and make you the leader of a new nation.
And Moses is begging.
And Moses actually, right, says no.
No.
Moses says, if you destroy them, which God says God's going to do, then destroy me, erase me from the book you're writing. And in a moment that I really think says a lot about Jewish theology, Moses actually convinces God. Moses Moses agrees they're doing something horrible down below, but recognizes the humanity and that this is human nature to make a mistake. And when Moses comes down, he's so angered that, right, he destroys the commandments and needs to go back and get another set of tablets. But Moses actually pleads on behalf of the people in spite of what they're doing, in spite of not recognizing these first two statements, these first two of the 10 Commandments.
David brought in, at least if I understood what David was saying, an interesting thought, at least for me, that one does not have to believe in God to accept a lot of these commandments. One does not need that belief, and I guess that's what the scientists would say, or the atheists would say. I can respect my parents, I can not murder, not steal, et cetera, et cetera. It's just an interesting thought.
Yeah, no,
I
it's,
don't know if David meant that, but that's
It's
what he
it's
said.
certainly
Kind of put
an
that on-
implication.
now it's very true, right? You definitely, belief in God is not a prerequisite for following the commands. And actually, ancient Near Eastern scholars would argue exactly as David said, that any Near Eastern law code, begins with the statement of the God or the leader, for whom these pronouncements matter because of who's giving them, right? They didn't have, a government the way we have today. How do you, if I break the law, what's gonna happen to me if there's nothing, if there's nothing ensuring, that the law is done? Here, this statement is, no, it matters because these aren't just random laws. This is God that's giving them, right? And that's the statement here. And also Abravanel, a medieval commentator, actually takes the same idea. The phrase, I am the Lord your God, constitutes no commandment. And this is the top of the final page here, either dogmatic or practical, but is merely a preface to the subsequent commandments and injunctions, a declaration making known to the children of Israel who is addressing them. So there is a debate, even among the commentators and the prominent commentators, whether this is actually a commandment, and actually a question of whether the first two are commandments themselves, the two uttered by God potentially, or whether it's simply a preface. You should follow these commandments because I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Yeah.
But that also would account for the fact that there are at least three different versions of counting the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
Especially the beginning ones are in different order. You can't ask someone what's the fifth commandment because it's different in different religions.
Well, things are worded a little differently here and in Deuteronomy. The 10 Commandments as a whole are similar, but there are differences. For instance,
but I'm not talking about those differences. I'm
You mean the
talking about the
Christians?
fact that for some, the first commandment is like. two
Right,
different
so in Jewish
commandments.
tradition, they're the same order.
Right,
There are different traditions in different places, yes.
It seems God's gotten to the point, he's not referencing our covenants anymore. That it's not on the God of the covenants, and that's tied to the mitzvot. It's, look what I've done for you recently, I think, at Egypt. And it's later, the rabbis come back in and tie the covenant and the mitzvot and all of that. So I find that interesting, because that would have been, that's an argument that you can't, not that you can't, but we're fulfilling the mitzvot in honor of our covenant rather than just to fulfill them. And God doesn't use that card here. I don't know if there's
Yeah.
anything relevant to that. I don't know, none of the commentaries either here that we're looking at.
Yeah, they're not specifically about this, but, right, in many ways, Jewish tradition, we see that observing the mitzvot is a sign of the covenant. Why?
But at this point, God's not saying, you know, he doesn't even say I was a God of, you know, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I took at it. He didn't give a
Right, here
long
it's-
list.
right.
It's just, bam, this is what I did, and here's where we go.
And here, yeah,
Yeah, so.
but,
Frequently, over and over again in different places, it says things like, I hereby make a covenant with you this day, et cetera, and so forth, which always made me wonder, is it the same covenant restated? Is it renewed covenant? Is it a new covenant? Are there multiple covenants?
613 covenants, not
good,
613.
so Jewish tradition, you know, is that there's one covenant and more might be part of, might have become part of that covenant. In terms of doing our part to,
Well, and I suppose
To be a
biblical
part of the
criticism
covenant.
would say if it's repeating that language or something similar somewhere else, it's just a different tradition woven in. I don't know. It just, based on what Bill said, it made me just think about this reality that the covenant just keeps being slammed and over and over again, and we still screw up. Maybe that says something about human nature and the relationship of human to divine and vice versa. I don't know.
good, right, and ultimately codified as this covenant is that we observe 613 mitzvot, we follow the Torah. And in exchange, right, God gave us, right, and we're loyal to God, God gave us the Torah, God is with us.
Right, I think modern Jews feel God isn't always with us. We have a lot of history, last century and the like, that makes us maybe feel that, you know, why should we hold up our end of the covenant? God's
Right.
not holding up.
And in fact,
Yeah.
right, this is Jewish theology is kind of, in fact, it's ingrained in the Torah. And in the books of the prophets especially, we turned away from God, God turned away from us. In fact, it's theologically problematic from a modern perspective, at least in my eyes, but constantly, you know, the prophets are saying, right, and even in the Talmud, it said the temple was destroyed because of senseless hatred. There was something that we did that prompted our destruction. I don't always love that theology today because, right. And for various reasons, right, you can think about, we don't want to blame our suffering on our own actions, because it often, you know, we don't feel it's our own actions, but that really is how biblical theology is developed. Is that it's never because of our enemy that was just stronger than us or defeated us. It was, we did something wrong that prompted God to go away from us, but always with a promise. The biblical theology is that always with a promise that God will return to us. If we
Ironically, that seems to me to be part of why we endure, because we don't end up, when we succumb to our enemies, we blame it on ourselves and continue to try to do better, as opposed to a group of people who might have not only succumbed to the enemy, but then just integrated into the enemy because they're obviously stronger, their gods were better than our gods, or whatever the reason. So we don't do that in part because of that theology, even if it is in some respects problematic.
Yeah, no, right. In some ways, because of its ingrained theology, may have helped the survival ultimately of the Jewish people. It's an interesting thought that there's never, Jews have, while there always have been certain Jews that have assimilated into the general population, Judaism and Jewish people at large have remained, you know, separate, believing that it's because of us that something went wrong. And if only we're more devout, if only we connect to the mitzvot, if only we cleave to God, God will come back to us. So it's an interesting idea.
Gamblers believe.
Yeah, right, right, the gambler. It's like a gambler's. Yeah.
Rabbi, you just said.
Yeah.
Big payoff.
You just already that God abandoned us. But what you just said, that God abandoned us. If you have to come back, that
So,
means he left.
so what I'm saying, I'm not saying my own personal belief, but
No,
in
yeah,
the,
but the way he
in the
said it.
Torah,
Yeah.
in the books of the prophets, right? God abandoned, I don't know if I need to see what the exact word is, but essentially, right, God pulls away because of the sins of the people.
Yeah, but if there's a return, there's an abandonment.
Right, correct, correct.
You can't have
Yeah.
the horse before the
No, no,
cart
you're right.
and the cart before the horse.
Right, and that's,
One at a time.
that is
The arguable-
the biblical view of theology is exactly that.
But the arguable genius of the prophets is that it's never a full abandonment. It's always a
Right.
chastisement, if you will. And,
It's a threat.
and you have,
Correct.
you have the ability, we, that is, have the ability to return. And if we do, God's waiting with open arms.
Right. The only concern I have with the word abandonment, it is, but it's not a full abandonment, right? It's a,
Then it's a
it's-
threat.
it's a threat, it's a pulling away with an understanding that God will eventually return. But yes,
But there are those that say, if I understand that we have this belief that God gave us the ability to make decisions on our own. God doesn't control our decisions. We get to make our own decisions. So if our decisions are contrary to what God wants us to do, is God pulling away from us or are we pulling away from God?
or perhaps both, at least in the biblical theology, yeah.
You can look at it from a different point of view. This road, we remained as Jews because of all the persecutions. They in fact put us in a slammer, together. As a matter of fact, in times of goodness, like in United States or in Germany before World War II, there was a lot of assimilation. And nowadays also the younger generation, they shy away, they don't belong to synagogues. They are more assimilations now than ever before in United States.
Disenchantment.
So there is a sociological reality. This isn't in the Torah, but there's a sociological reality that when things are good, people are excited, they're ready to become part of the culture. We see, we talk about Hanukkah as the revolt, against the Greeks. But really the Maccabees revolt, in studying the history is largely against Hellenized Jews who want to, get rid of the Torah and celebrate Greek life because that was seen as the pinnacle of society in its day. So the challenge of assimilation is not a new challenge. But it's true that when things are going well, which God willing, things are God willing, things are good for us in the community. But it does lead to a challenge where people say, oh, I don't need my Jewish community. Look at all the great things in America or wherever we are. It's often when things are bad that we say we need to find God. We need to seek out God.
I mean, another way of looking at that, though, is they kill us with kindness and they kill us with unkindness. Because I sometimes think, how many Jews would there be in the world if we didn't have killing us with unkindness, like pogroms of the Holocaust on the one hand, and killing us with kindness on the other hand, which is, German aristocrats looking for wealthy Jewish daughters to marry into the money, but they don't expect anybody to stay Jewish when that happens, or whatever might be happening now in America where somebody says, I don't know, my religion is I don't know, not Judaism, but being an American or whatever.
Yeah, no,
Because there are
very.
some who will go that far if you push them.
Good. So thank you. I want to pull back to wrap up here. Because, right, the connection, the connection here, we were talking about, you know, the connection to covenant, to what we, to what our part is, what our job is to, so that God will be with us. And we talked about 613 mitzvot, and if I ask anyone here how many mitzvot are there in the Torah, we just know the number 613. It's what we've always been taught. And
For you guys, not for us.
well, so it's been interpreted differently through history. I will say from the conservative movement's perspective, it's for all. But yes, different times and different interpretations, right, have interpreted. And historically, there are certain mitzvot that were only incumbent upon men in the communities. There were a few mitzvot that were specifically incumbent upon women, particularly Hadlakat Neirot, lighting the Shabbat candles, and a couple others.
Oh, he's talking broader.
Forget the law.
Well, lighting Shabbat candles, right? There are many mitzvot that we consider mitzvot that aren't directly elucidated in the Torah. But Oneg Shabbat, joy of Shabbat, has been interpreted by the rabbis as lighting Shabbat candles. But that's a separate, that's a separate question. But is anyone familiar with gematria? That each Hebrew letter has a number associated. Does anyone do the math? You can read here, but can anyone do the math? What does the word Torah equal?
611.
Torah equals 611, right? You can, it says it here, but a taf is 400, a resh is 200, it's 600. The vav is 6 and the hey is 5. So 611.
Where are we gonna get the other two, Rabbi?
Yeah, right.
The Torah.
Where are we gonna get the other?
Torah.
Bet Torah is
Rabbi
600. But Torah is 611. And so the Talmud questions that. How do we know there's 613? Because Moshe commanded the Torah. And how many verses how many mitzvot according to the Torah did Moshe tell the people? 611. 611. In addition, there are two mitzvot that God's self told the people, and those were these two that we said, and we debated whether or not they're mitzvot, but according to the Talmud and according as Maimonides and Ibn Ezra pick up, do consider them mitzvot. The mitzvah, I am the Lord your God, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Adonai Elohecha. This is a mitzvah, you know, I am God, that God spoke to the people, as did the second mitzvah, that you shall have no other gods before you, are the two mitzvot we heard directly from God's mouth. And so that's where the other two, the 611 Torah is from Moshe Misinai. So there are 611 mitzvot that Moshe gave to the people through God.
I don't know.
But there are two mitzvot, these two, that God spoke directly to the people. And so that's where the Talmud gets 613. And later we have Maimonides and others, Sefer HaChinuch, elucidating what are the actual 613 mitzvot. In the Talmud, they actually don't give us an exact listing of the 613, but we do know there's 611 plus the two God speaks directly from the Talmud.
So my understanding is now we attribute, even though it says Moshe brought 611, there are Torah-based mitzvot and there were rabbinic mitzvot. And he would have, clearly he had to be giving them all over at one time if it's 611. So why do we feel we can, in light of that, later say, no, these are rabbinic, those are Moshe, and here's a couple from God, and there's a pecking order to them, right? One can't supersede the other.
Well,
answer me that, Rabbi.
So this is a longer question. But the rabbis of the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Talmud believe themselves to be the true inheritors of the tradition. And that the tradition that the written Torah and the oral Torah are of equal value. And the rabbis take it upon themselves to elucidate the Torah by sharing what the mitzvot are, even if those mitzvot themselves aren't listed directly in the Torah. For instance, lighting Hanukkah candles. What do we say? What's the blessing before we light Hanukkah candles? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav. That you commanded, you sanctified us with your commandments to light the Hanukkah candles. Now, where in the Torah does it talk about Hanukkah candles?
No,
Ever.
but it
Right, where
was
in the
much
Bible does it
later.
talk about
It
Hanukkah?
was much later.
Right, and yet it's a mitzvah from God. So I'll just share this quickly because it's a great example. We also hear it to listen to the Megillah on Purim, clearly not in the Torah. So where do these mitzvot come from? They come from the rabbis. The rabbis consider themselves to be in the line of God. They're interpreting tradition. So they say this is a mitzvah from God, even though the rabbis clearly are writing it. It's not in the Torah itself. And it becomes known as a mitzvah de Rabbanan versus a mitzvah de Oraita, mitzvah from the Torah. According to the rabbis, their mitzvot are equally important. But through Jewish history, Jews have generally considered the mitzvahs that are in the Torah to be more important. In fact, I'll give one last example of what the rabbis do, and then I see a last couple comments. But for instance, it's the rabbis that ordain there will be a 2 days of Yom Tov. In Israel, we celebrate based on the Torah. There's one first day of Passover and one Yom Tov at the end of Passover. There's 1 day of Shavuot, not 2 days. The rabbis were concerned people weren't following their rabbinically ordained mitzvah and were only showing up to shul and only practicing, one of the days. And so the rabbis later on ordained, at least the Ashkenazi rabbis, created a service called Yizkor for the 2nd day of Shavuot, the 8th day of Pesach, so that people, because they knew that was important, memorializing, they knew if they did that, people would come on the day that wasn't in the Torah itself. Ironically, today, I think we find that people just come for Yizkor on the rabbinically ordained day and not maybe on the day that the Torah tells us is actually from the Torah itself. But the rabbis did consider their mitzvot.
They hadn't developed the idea of a luncheon.
Right. Yeah, the last two, Rana and Tiana, yeah, and then we'll.
What I was gonna say, if the rabbis think that, the first, you just said the rabbis think that their Talmud is, or the oral law.
Yes, the Talmud is equal to
Is
their
equal to the
two sides of the same
But
coin.
then, when they're figuring out what is what rules it's always the older thing, the older book is always more important.
So let me,
It's closer to Sinai, so
This is where-
they can't say that the oral law or their laws are just as important as the Torah law.
Torah
They're
Sheba'al,
against themselves.
the Torah Sheba'al Peh is equal to the Torah. How they
Yeah,
know
because the-
they're,
the
because they don't,
is theirs.
right. Because there are various traditions that come down in history, the only thing that's written that is known for a certainty is the Torah.
Right.
So while the Torah Sheba'al Peh is of equal importance, knowing whether they have the Torah Sheba'al Peh right or not is maybe a question that you don't have with the written Torah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Siona, and then we'll.
I
we'll
had a
wrap up.
question.
Yeah.
How many of the mitzvot are in the Torah?
So according 613 mitzvot in the
All
Torah.
of them you. can
613
find in the
mitzvot.
Torah?
You can point to. And point to. a-
My mom points to 613 verses that allude to mitzvot. Now, as I mentioned, right, lighting Shabbat candles, it doesn't say direct. Tefillah 3 times a day, doesn't say directly in the Torah. But Maimonides does find verses in the Torah that he claims connect to the mitzvah.
And Larry and I studied the Sefer thing, the verses of
Yeah.
613. And I said, that's not they count as 2 commandments. No, that's not 2 commandments. That's 2 sentences
You
about the same.
you might read it and disagree with.
Yeah, I don't agree that there's 6.
Yeah. Okay, let's, I want to make sure everyone has a chance, yeah, and.
Going back to the 2 days holidays.
Yeah,
I believe it was established so people who were Chutz La'aretz were
Yeah.
able to, because in Israel, they know the day, they say. They know
Right.
when it is.
Because that's at the beginning of the month,
So they established.
right.
unless you're reformed.
Second day, there's various interpretations given. That's one of the reasons given, but different places, there's other reasons. But right, it was a rabbinically ordained mitzvah as for Chutz La'aretz, right? As the Jews are no longer in.
It
in-
commemorates when we didn't have the fixed calendar, the reality that you had to have witnesses, and the witnesses' decision, the decision of the Sanhedrin based on the witnesses didn't get out to the hinterlands outside
Right,
of.
it was Bates, right, there were a number of reasons that are given, but
Right.
you're correct. So as we read the Torah, we chant the 10 Commandments this Shabbat. that there's more, than meets the eye, and perhaps Ten Commandments is not the proper translation even. But I wanna, leave everyone, with this seminal moment. It's really, we don't typically stand when we chant from the Torah, but the tradition is that we actually stand when the Ten Commandments are read, the Aseret HaDibrot are read, for this seminal moment that we have this Shabbat. So it is happy Tu B'Shvat to everyone, and encourage you to join us this evening as our Tu B'Shvat Seder and learning. Is it 7 p.m.? 7 p.m. Right, I believe right in this spot. So join us 7 p.m. Register if you haven't yet.
And the Zoomers asked me to ask you to put it on stream or.
I will let them know. I'll let Rabbi Jacobs know. And Mike had do you want to share? Anyone lost a dollar coin?